Separate but not equal, the story of Ruby Bridges and her fight for rights.
Washington, and it is my opinion that the South will be law-abiding and will comply with the decision of the court and accept it as members of our democratic society.
I don't think there's any question about it in the South. People in the South are just as law-abiding as anybody else, and other decisions have come down which they said they wouldn't like, and there's never been any trouble as a result of any of these decisions. So in Mount Bayou, Mississippi, 9,000 Negroes met together with no problem at all and discussed segregation and the ending of segregation.
This speech by Earl Warren was spoken after the Brown v. Board of Education case in the Supreme Court. The final decision was all schools must integrate, and separate schools for blacks and whites was unconstitutional. In early 1960s, a U.S. law said New Orleans was too slow to integrate and must integrate all schools by September. The National Association of the Advancement of Colored People was an organization that helped African Americans receive their rights. NAACP tested African American kindergartners in New Orleans. Kids who did good on the hard test were allowed to integrate in white public New Orleans schools. 5 girls passed the test. 1 girl's parents decided not to integrate. The other 3 would be going to the McDonough school. Jimmy H. Davis, Louisiana governor, supported the segregationists. He threatened to close all public schools before integrating them. Federal District Court Judge J. Skelly Wright blocked the segregationists' anti-integration laws. He said these laws were unconstitutional. The new deadline for school integration would be November 14th. On November 14th, 6-year-old Ruby Bridges was escorted by U.S. Marshals to her new school. As she walked up to her school, angry mobs screamed and threatened her. The U.S. Marshals surrounded her to protect her from the angry mob. Ruby did not get to do anything on her first day of school. Her and her mom sat in the principal's office and watched as angry parents ran in and took their children out of the classroom. The police had to hold the angry mob back. One woman screamed the same threat at Ruby every day. "I'm going to poison you. I'll find a way." This threat later caused Ruby to only eat potato chips and soda. She didn't eat any cooked meals. Another woman held a coffin with a black doll in it. These type of women were known as the cheerleaders. John Steinbeck said, "No newspaper had printed the words these women shouted. It was indicated that they were indelicate. Some even said obscene. On television, the soundtrack was made to blur or had crowd noises cut in to cover. But now I heard the words, bestial and filthy and degenerate." Norman Rockwell made a painting called The Problem We All Live With. It was of Ruby and the Marshals. It shows the evils of the segregationists. Reverend Lloyd Foreman believed in integration, so he kept his daughter Pam in school. Segregationists taunted them. The Gabrielles were another brave family. Daisy and Jim kept their daughter Yolanda, a first grader, in school. Yolanda stayed in school for 3 weeks. Their family's home was attacked. Stones and rotten eggs were thrown at the house. The windows were broken. Hecklers threatened to hurt the Gabrielle children outside of the house. The Gabrielle family ended up moving to a northern state after 3 weeks. Trouble broke out across the city. Protesters threw rocks and bricks at cars. Some threw flaming bottles of gasoline. White people left burning crosses in African American neighborhoods. This originated from the Ku Klux Klan, a segregationist organization. When the week-long Thanksgiving break came around, City School Superintendent James F. Redmond made it clear that school integration would still continue after the break. The segregationists were still there when Ruby returned to school. On December 8th, the attendance at William Frantz Elementary School was 18, although they were kept away from Ruby. Neighbors helped Ruby and her family. At night, they watched the house to make sure the segregationists weren't there. They babysat or helped Ruby in the morning. Men from the community also walked behind the marshal's car to protect her. Another neighbor gave Ruby's dad a house painting job. John F. Kennedy fought for civil rights.
Whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content?
Barbara Henry, Ruby's teacher, was the only one in the school who was not racist. The principal was a prejudiced woman. When Mrs. Henry found other children who have been coming to school in the spring, she told the principal she wanted Ruby to be with the other first graders. The principal said no until Mrs. Henry threatened to call the superintendent. The principal eventually said yes, but the other teachers did not want to teach Ruby, so Mrs. Henry had the other children come to her class for a part of each day. Robert Coles, a child psychiatrist, wanted to help Ruby in some way, so he told the NAACP. He had sessions with Ruby Bridges and had her draw pictures with crayons. He was able to see what she was feeling through these pictures. Towards the end of the year, more children came back to school. Ruby still did not understand racism until a boy said a rude comment to her. The principal disliked Ruby so much, she wanted to change Ruby's grades to make them lower. She said Ruby received so much individual attention that her grades were not fair. At the end of the year, the protesters died down. The marshals disappeared. A taxi driver drove Ruby instead. And then second grade came and there was no one. Ruby had a new teacher, and this time a bunch of kids were there, a few African Americans too. That was the story of Ruby Bridges' life and her protest against African Americans' segregation. An interview with Ruby Bridges.
You must have been afraid as you walked to school through a mob of angry people shouting at you. Were you aware of the danger? How did you overcome your fear?
I was never really afraid because I wasn't quite sure what was going on at the time. It seemed like Mardi Gras because in New Orleans I'm accustomed to Mardi Gras. So I wasn't afraid for a very long time.
How did your first grade teacher, Miss Henry, touch your life?
Mrs. Henry had a huge impact on my life. Mrs. Henry became my best friend, so she wasn't just my teacher. She was my only friend in school. The mere fact that I didn't have other kids to play with, it was just her and I, and she made school fun, so she really made a huge impression.
African Americans were lacking civil rights and were experiencing segregation. African Americans fought for their rights. There was a group called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People who fought for African American civil rights and to be treated like white Americans and give African Americans a better life. The Supreme Court ruled it was unlawful to keep African Americans in separate schools. So the NAACP gave kindergartners a test to take, and Ruby Bridges passed, so she was allowed to integrate into a white school in first grade. Ruby Bridges impacted African Americans' rights because she integrated into a white school in the South and showed the world that African Americans are equal to white Americans.